Hi again, and welcome to Family Stress Theory. I think you're going to like this one. It's pretty easy to understand and has clear applications for research and intervention, and may even help you in your own life. So, family stress theory was actually started within the field of family studies, unlike some of the other theories we're studying, like feminist and social exchange and family systems, which were all started in other fields and then moved into the field of family studies. So this theory began around the Great Depression, when researchers were trying to figure out why some families who were dealing with the loss of household income and unemployment were doing okay, and others were not. And they actually talked about things that are pretty similar to the circumplex model that we learned about with family systems, which is that families that were more successful in responding to financial losses during the Great Depression were more cohesive or more integrated and more adaptable. And then came along Reuben Hill, who's considered the father of family stress theory, and he was studying families around the time of World War II and wondering why at times of separation or reunion before and during and after the war, why did some families do well and others fell apart? And so we're going to hear more about Reuben Hill's theories. So these are all variations of family stress theory, and most of them we're going to be talking about the ones in blue. The McCubbin and McCubbin Farr model we aren't covering, but you may come across that in your own research. You'll notice that the family stress model, which we've talked about in terms of related to economics, isn't on this list. Even though it has a similar name to family stress theory, it's considered a separate model. Hill's first model is called the Rollercoaster Profile of Adjustment, or the Rollercoaster Model. And it basically investigated families who had reached a crisis point, and then what was the process that they went through after the crisis. And so Hill said that as families adjust to a crisis, they have these stages. First, there's the crisis. Then there's the period of disorganization where they kind of fall apart, right? Because the reason why it's a crisis is the stress has exceeded their ability to kind of cope, right? Exceeded their coping, their resources. And so now they're in a period of disorganization. And then they have this angle of recovery, which gives us a sense of how deeply are they disorganized, or severely are they disorganized? How long do they spend in a period of disorganization? And then how long does it take them to recover? So the angle of recovery kind of talks about the severity of the disorganization and also the length of time for recovery. And then families can come out to a new level of organization. And this graph just shows kind of, one level where they come back out to where they started. But we'll see some upcoming pictures that help us realize that they can reorganize at a better level, the same level, or a worse level than from where they started. And that if you've ever heard that the Chinese symbol for crisis combines the symbols for danger and opportunity, that kind of exemplifies this. Crisis is a dangerous opportunity. It's both the potential to do worse than you were doing before, but also the potential to be doing better than you were before. The ABCX model is Hill's most famous model. It's the one that's used most commonly in research, and you'll still see it used in the articles that you're finding. And what he did here is he actually went back to think about what's happening in families before something becomes a crisis to determine whether or not it becomes a crisis. So he kind of did these models in reverse. He did crisis and afterwards first, and then he theorized around what was happening beforehand to make something a crisis or not. So we've got a few slides coming. So the ABCX model starts with the A, the stressor event. And a stressor event in this model can be something big, like a hurricane, or something small, like taking the GRE, which you may not think is small, or it could be a good stressor, like getting married, or a bad stressor, like the death of a parent. And you can see there that stressor events are not positive or negative until they are interpreted. So, for example, pregnancy as a stressor event could be considered more positive if it's a wanted pregnancy, or it could be more negative if it's an unwanted pregnancy, or for example, a death could be more positive if the person was old and suffering, but could be considered more negative if it was sudden and untimely. And then, of course, even though we think about stress as negative events, again, there's lots of happy events that can be stressful, right? Getting married, getting a new job, graduating from college, for example, is a big stressor event. These are all talked about in your textbook as well. And the way I've set it up is that the first word in the versus bullet point is typically easier than the second word. So internal versus external. This is basically about who made the decision. Is it internal to the family or external to the individual or family? So it's if a dad chooses to quit his job to stay home with the kids, that's an internal stress. An external stress is he got laid off. So you could imagine that in general, internal stresses are better than external, but not always. You might think about the relationship breakup, right? If you break up with someone else, it's an internal stress. If they're breaking up with you, it's an external stress. Okay, so is it one member versus multiple members of the family? So if my coworker dies, was it just someone I was close to and it only really affects me, one member of the family? Or was everyone in my family, is it a family friend, my coworker? And so everybody is affected by that. And so generally it's easier if it's, not as many people in the family directly affected. And then gradual versus sudden. Stressor events that come on more gradually are generally easier to take on than those that are more sudden. So let's say I find out I have cancer. It's easier if I find out I have cancer at stage 1, and harder if I find out I have cancer at stage 3 or 4 that's more advanced. Expected versus unexpected. If we go back to that cancer example, if I was somewhat expecting it, like I've been smoking cigarettes all my life, and because I just couldn't quit, and I kind of had in the back of my mind that I might get lung cancer, then it's a little bit expected. But if I've been super healthy and I get lung cancer, then it's really unexpected. Short-term versus long-term. This is, let's say I have a illness, do I anticipate, or an injury, do I anticipate this being a 6-week thing, or do I anticipate this being, a year-long or 2-year-long or permanent experience? Natural versus human-made. This is interesting because sometimes the characteristics of the event can be the same, but it matters how it happened. So if my house burns down, it makes a difference in my coping experiences whether or not it was due to a lightning strike and natural causes, or if someone intentionally set my house on fire, or they even made an accidental mistake. That does kind of influence how stressful or how we process the event. And then normative versus non-normative. So if we think about a child leaving home, a teenager leaving home, it's more normative to do that when you graduate from high school. It's non-normative to move out in the middle of your senior year. And so we would imagine that something that's non-normative on average is more stressful. And then unambiguous versus ambiguous. We'll talk about this more on the next slide with the theory of ambiguous loss, but basically stressors that are more clear or unambiguous are easier for us to deal with than things that are ambiguous. So it's in some ways easier to graduate from college and go straight into a job or grad school, even if that's stressful as well, than to graduate from college and not know what you're doing and be in limbo. Even though that's a really normal experience, having that limbo, that ambiguity, creates stress for us. This is probably also why when we are kind of having a rocky relationship with someone and we can't decide whether to stay together or separate, someone usually calls it and makes a decision, because staying in the gray area, in the ambiguity, is hard. So Pauline Boss, who was a professor at the University of Minnesota, she's now retired, is really credited for the theory of ambiguous loss. And this was she built on family stress theory. She basically took the conceptualization of the A, or stressor event, and added in that idea of ambiguity and being unambiguous, like we talked about on the previous slide. Her early examples were studying families where a person was physically absent but psychologically present. So families that had a soldier missing in action, or the really scary and sad situation of families with kidnapped children, where there was this person who wasn't in their lives, but as far as they knew was still alive, and that could be in some ways more stressful than just having a loved one die, because it's this gray area, this limbo time where you don't know kind of where they are or what's happened to them. And then she did kind of the opposite in researching families with a loved one with dementia, where you've got this person physically present in front of you, but they're not themselves anymore, and so they're psychologically absent. And so how that's stressful too. You can't decide whether or not you're grieving them or not, because they're there physically, but they're not really themselves. And so this concept of ambiguous loss has gone on to be explained or used in a lot of different ways, but those are some early examples. Pauline Boss, for example, sent a team, including herself, to 9/11 and worked with families who had lost loved ones in the 9/11 Twin Towers, and how difficult it was to cope. I mean, obviously because for many reasons, but also because there was the ambiguity around how they died, and there was no body, and they didn't always know what had happened at the end, and so that can make things more difficult to cope with. The B in the ABCX model is pretty easy to wrap your mind around. It's just resources. What does the family use as resources to cope with the stress or respond to the stress? And this can be resources that each individual has in the family, like problem-solving abilities, or it could be their intelligence or economics or education. This could also be family-level resources. And again, this is like the circumplex model, that they might be more adaptable and flexible or more cohesive. And then, of course, this can be community resources like churches, temples, friends, social support, professionals, educators. And so you might imagine, for example, that if we're a family with a transgender child, it's going to be really different if we're living in Denver versus we're living in rural Nebraska in terms of the community resources available. And all of these resources can be more tangible, like money, or intangible, like our ability to adapt. So the C of the ABCX model is a little bit harder to understand, but it's basically the mental work that you're doing to make sense of this stressor event and the situation. And so this can be cognitive appraisal, and you want to, the more you could appraise a stressor event as in a more optimistic or positive way, the better for outcomes. So kind of a sense that we can get through this, we can manage it. Versus more negative and more pessimistic. So if you could imagine going through a relationship breakup, which most all of us have, we could appraise that more negatively, like, I'm never going to find love again, versus more positively, this happens to all of us, I have support, I will get through this, I will find someone else. But I don't really advocate just total Pollyanna, attitude, or just bright-siding everything, because obviously some stressor events are so stressful, like the sudden death of a child or someone close to us, that optimism and positivity aren't really realistic. So some of the C depends upon the nature of the stressor event, the A, and also the resources that you have to cope with it. Another part of kind of the C is meaning making. So the more we can make sense of an event as something that is going to make us a better person, or bring us together as a family, or teach us things, the more that has beneficial outcomes. And this is also talked about as sense of coherence in the disabilities literature. So families who have children with special needs, the more that they can make meaning around how having a child with special needs has changed them or brought more meaning to their lives or their family, the better outcomes for, parents and kids. And, just on a tangent, I think most of what therapists are doing are trying to help people make meaning or have a sense of coherence about stressful things in their lives. And then the last one is breaking the stressor event or the need for resources or the steps down into manageable parts or tasks, kind of the cognitive work that we do. So whenever you start a new semester, right, when you do things like you look at the course syllabus and initially you feel overwhelmed by everything you have to do in all your classes, but then you go through and put it all into your planner or make a big calendar of when everything is due or come up with a method to kind of wrap your mind around it all. This makes it more manageable. Those of us who love lists, right, we are doing a lot to break stress down into more manageable parts. So the X in the ABCX model isn't necessarily a crisis. It's the outcome, but it can be a crisis. A crisis is basically reached when the family can't maintain their stability, their homeostasis, their equilibrium. So when the nature of the stress and their resources or lack thereof leads them to be disorganized, right, and enter a state of crisis. But if the family is able to kind of use their resources or their, kind of definition of the situation, their C, or if the stress, the A, isn't too difficult, then it doesn't become a crisis. And I have basically coping there in the model as an interaction between the A, the B, and the C. Researchers using family stress theory have had a hard time figuring out where to put coping in the ABCX model. Like, is it a B, like a resource? Is it a C, the way you're kind of thinking about it? Your research article might put it in different places, but in some ways it's kind of the interaction of the A, the B, and the C. This slide just shows us what it would look like if we combined the rollercoaster model, the first model that Hill came up with the second model, the ABCX model. But of course, ABCX comes first, rollercoaster comes second. And this shows us what it looks like when the X does become a crisis. As we talked about, it doesn't necessarily become a crisis, but if it does, then that means that there's a period of disorganization, then a period of reorganization, and then this shows us kind of the level of reorganization, right? That it could be better, the same, or worse than where a family started. And it also shows that idea of a pileup of stressor events. And so that we're going to talk about this with the double ABCX model, which is coming, but if stressor events kind of come one on top of each other, then it becomes harder for families to reorganize, and they stay kind of in a disorganized or increasingly disorganized state. Okay, so as we think about the key concepts in family stress theory, they are all the things that we've just already talked about with the rollercoaster and ABCX models. And so I've just listed them here for clarity so that you've got them when you're perhaps, summarizing family stress theory. So McCubbin and Patterson built on Hill's model with the double ABCX model, thinking about what happens when there's basically that pileup of stressor events or multiple stressful events happening. I think about this as the domino effect, where one stress can trigger the second, which can trigger the third, which can trigger the fourth. So for example, if we think about divorce, maybe it starts with parents fighting, right, or in conflict. So there's that first stressor event. And then maybe separation is the second stressor event, and divorce is the third. And then the fourth stressor event is moving and changing schools. And the, fifth stressor event is finding a new job and financial changes. And the sixth stressor event is dating new people or, coming up with rules across households or co-parenting or things like that. And so what you could see there is that the first A is the first kind of stressor event, and then there's all these other A's or stressor events that come after. And with each stressor event, the family has to kind of go through the process of identifying resources, defining the situation, meaning making, perceiving it, and then this can lead to an overall, at the end, kind of level of bone adaptation, which is positive, kind of just basic similar adaptation, or maladaptation, which is more negative over time. And the idea is that how we've coped with the earlier stressors influences how we cope with the later stressors. And so, for example, my husband, has had multiple knee surgeries. And so generally what we feel like is, okay, we've coped with this well the first time. We could deal with it physically, financially. You've recovered well, so that generally that spills over into feeling like, okay, we can handle this second surgery, right? Because we did well the first time. But we could have had a very different experience of, oh my gosh, we've exhausted our financial resources, or you didn't recover well, or the caregiving is too intense, right? And so the ways that we've coped with the previous stressors can influence how we cope with the new stressors in different ways. We may feel more like, yep, we've got this. We may feel like, oh, we've exhausted our resources. Or we may feel like, wow, we didn't do so well the first time. We need to do better the second time. So even though the ABCX model and the double ABCX model are really useful models, as you can see, they really only deal with one stressor at one point in time. So even the double ABCX kind of implies this domino effect. It doesn't address so well what happens if your partner dies and you, in an unrelated way, you lose your job all in a short amount of time. It also doesn't do a great job addressing stressors that are continuous, like various forms of discrimination or poverty or disadvantage. And of course, it only focuses on families during times of stress. So the MEIS model, which stands for Mundane Extreme Environmental Stress, incorporates the pervasive effects of racism and discrimination into the family stress model. So mundane means common, and extreme means harsh, and then environment means coming from the environment, obviously. A recent update to this model by Smith and Landor adds intersectionality to this to think about how various forms of discrimination influence all four factors, the A, the B, the C, and the X in the model. So for example, intersectionality influences stigma and discrimination, which then influences your social position and your relative, advantage or disadvantage, which then influences not only the stressors you experience, but also the resources you have, the perspectives you take, and your outcome. So a more specific example, African Americans are 13% of the population in the United States, and they may often find themselves being the only visible person in their racial group, perhaps in a work context, a social setting, a school setting. And this is referred to as solo status. And so then that becomes an additional constant stressor that is happening on top of, whatever work, school, or social stressors you're experiencing, a stressor maybe about being judged more harshly based on what you say, do, or how you look, all related to the color of your skin. Some of the strengths of family stress theory is that it still seems very relevant today as it did when it was created, and it seems relevant for both everyday stressors, like children leaving home, or the caregiving responsibilities that we might have for taking care of an aging family member, and also major disasters like 9/11 or hurricanes or things like that. It also seems to be a model that really lends itself for intervention programming at the individual, family, or kind of community level. So we could imagine maybe we wanted to develop a program for couples who have experienced a miscarriage. We might develop it based on the ABCX model. We might teach them about characteristics of the A, or talk about the characteristics of the miscarriages that can make it particularly stressful, that it was an external stressor event that's out of your control, that it maybe was ambiguous because you can't decide whether or not a person died or not, or maybe society doesn't necessarily see it how you see it. It might have been more gradual or more sudden. And then we might think about in our group, how do we make sure that people have enough resources? What are the resources we could help them with individually? How can we help them connect as a couple and come together, or other social support systems? How can we help them tap into resources in their community? And then C, how do we give them a framework or a venue for making meaning, for putting words to their experience, for maybe developing a sense of optimism, meaning making, or coherence around the miscarriage. So that would be just an example of how having ABCX in our minds might influence how we set up our programs. I've also noticed as a therapist that you could bring this model in to a family and just have them kind of work together to kind of talk through the A, the B, and the C, and figure out if they're, use the model to figure out where to target your interventions, or, what their strengths are and what their challenges are in terms of resources or meaning making, or breaking it down into manageable tasks. So here's some example ways that family stress theory has been used in research. It's been used to study kind of normative stressors like the transition to parenthood, adjusting to the death of a spouse, moving, retiring, transitioning to adolescents who want more independence, and also non-normative stressors like caregiving that you wouldn't expect, like caring for a young spouse, or divorce, which, even though it's common, isn't something that people expect to have to go through. So if you're interested in going a little bit further with family stress theory, you can apply it to your own life, right? Think about something that's happening for you individually or with your family, and use the questions on this slide to kind of analyze your experience. What's the A, what's the B, what's the C, and what do you think your X is going to be? Is it going to become a crisis, or will you be able to manage it without it becoming a crisis?